the record. Okay. Dear colleagues, students, engineers, and all attendees from all around Jordan, I welcome you all to the 5th lecture of the research series organized by the Women Engineering Jordan section under my supervision. I am Dr. Yusra Obedat, an associate professor in the Electronics Engineering Department at Yarmouk University. I'm currently the chair of Women Engineering Jordan section and the advisor of Women Engineering Yarmouk branch. I will begin our meeting today by introducing our distinguished speaker, Professor Céline Aviante. Professor Céline Aviante received her Bachelor of Science degree in Electrical and Electronics Engineering from Buzarje University, Istanbul in 1997, Master of Science and PhD degrees both in Electrical Engineering Systems from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor in 1999 and 2002 respectively. She joined the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at Michigan State University in 2002, where she is currently a professor for undergraduate studies. Her research focuses on statistical and non-stationary signal processing, higher order data representations, and network science with applications to biological signals. She has authored more than 150 peer-reviewed journal and conference papers. She is the recipient of a 2005 Withrow Teaching Excellence Award, a 2008 NSF Career Award, and 2021 Withrow Excellence in Diversity Award. She is currently serving as the chair of IEEE Signal Processing Society, Bioimaging and Signal Processing Technical Committee, on the steering committees of IEEE SPS Data Science Initiative and IEEE BRAIN. She was served as an associate editor and senior area editor for IEEE Transactions on Signal Processing, IEEE Transactions on Signal and Information Processing over Networks, IEEE Open Journal of Signal Processing and Digital Signal Processing. Her talk for today will be about learning on and from graphs, applications to social and biological sciences. I wish you all to enjoy and learn new information from her talk. Professor Céline, welcome abroad. We are delighted to have you with us today as a distinguished speaker. Thanks a lot for your contribution in our research series. I invite you now to begin your lecture. Please go ahead, the mic is yours.
Well, thank you for that introduction. I'll start by sharing my screen.
Yeah.
Can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay. So, good evening for you. So today I'm going to talk about a new area that has been active over the last decade in signal processing society, is learning from on and from graphical structure with some applications to social and biological science. So let me stop for a second because I think there's a timing with my slides that I do not want. Let me make sure that's not the... Sorry about this.
That's totally fine.
Okay. Okay, now it should be okay. Okay, so as I said, my talk will be on a relatively new area, an exciting area of research in signal processing, which is learning on graphs. And I'm going to talk about two aspects of this, both learning on graphical data and learning graphs from structured data. And I'll highlight some applications to social and biological sciences without getting too much in detail into the mathematical formulations, just to keep it more general. So network data is abundant in a lot of different types of applications, where many complex systems, whether they are physical, social, or biological systems, and relational data can be modeled as graphs. So in a lot of applications, this graphical structure data is already given to us. So for example, social networks, you can think of Facebook, where each user is represented as a node in the graph, and their relationships, whether they're friends or not, is represented by the existence of an edge or no edge. Or other systems like molecular systems can be modeled as graphs. Or you could have systems where you have information systems that could be modeled as graphs. So which computer station or server is communicating with which one. Or brains or neurons, where you can model the different areas of the brain as the nodes in this graph and their interactions with edges. Or any other type of like gene regulatory networks, where you have different genes and you have their interactions, which can be expressed as a graph. So in all of these cases, the nodes represent the different entities and the edges represent the interactions between them. In addition to this, we may have data that is not naturally in the form of a network, like social networks, which is naturally a network, but which I would call structured data. And a lot of data are often structured. What I mean by structured, so on the left, you have this temperature data, so temperature map in different locations. This is in Switzerland over a certain period of time, and the colors show the temperature. So red is higher temperatures, blue is lower temperatures. But you could actually think of this as a graphical data or structured data. Why does this data have structure? Well, you could take this as a single data vector showing the temperatures in different locations. However, you also have this side information of the proximity of different locations. So you can take that proximity into account and construct a graph showing the different areas or different cities in Switzerland as the nodes of your network. The edges can be put in terms of physical proximity. But in addition to that, now you have the temperature at each of these locations, at the values at each vertices. So this is what we talk about when we say graph signals, or where you have two types of data. One is a graph that models the pairwise relationships, and the other is graph signals, which are the values at different nodes. Another example of that could be traffic data, where the different regions in a state, so this is the state of Minnesota in the United States, and the different nodes can correspond to different intersections in the traffic flow. And the graph signals, or the values at each node, could be the amount of traffic at that particular node. So these two types of data can be combined and incorporated in a graph structure as well. So with both of these cases, where you have network data, naturally occurring network data, or signals that are not necessarily graph data, but they are structured, you can use graphs to model this type of data and then come up with new analysis techniques or learning models to actually learn from these structured data. So today in my talk, I'll give an overview of 3 different learning problems on graphs. The first problem is the easiest one, which applies to the case that I just talked about, where you have the graphical structure data. So graph structure is known. So this could be a social network, transportation network, where the nodes are different people and the edges are the relationships between them, for example. And in this case, you may want to identify some sort of structure or topology of these networks. And these could be different types of structure. You can identify the communities in this network, which are basically groups of nodes that are closely related to each other, or you may be interested in identifying the hub nodes. So in a transportation network, this may be important, like which regions, which cities are hub or important for flowing of the traffic. There are some challenges that I'm going to talk about in this area. So a lot of work has been done in this area where you have the graph structure and you're trying to learn some, discover something about this graph's topology. However, most of this work has been on single layers, single networks. And I'm going to talk about extensions to multi-layer and temporal graphs and other extensions like signed graphs, directed graphs, etc. The second learning problem is the case that the second case where you have structured data, where you have both the nodes, you have edges, and you have the graph signals. So an example of that could be a social network or a citation network where each node is a person, and then you have some measurement about each person. So it could be whether they're female, male, what are their hobbies, what profession they do, what age group. So those could be all the attributes or graph signals. Given this more enhanced structure, can you identify groups of nodes? So that's node classification. Can you identify groups of nodes of people, for example, or if it's a citation network, can you identify groups of papers that belong to a particular area? I think there is a question, so I can stop and take a question.
Any question?
Someone raised their hand.
Yes, I think yes, but I think he lowered his hand again.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's fine. Or another example of this could be brain networks, where you have the structural and functional network. Simultaneously, you may be analyzing that. The final problem, which is probably the most challenging one on graphs, is where you don't have the graph structure. You're observing the graph signals, so you could think of it as observing the temperature over a region, or observing the traffic pattern over a region, but you don't know exactly the physical graph. So given the graph signals, infer the most plausible graph structure. And this has a lot of applications in biology, because in biology, we don't really see the actual underlying graph. There is no way to see that, but you may be observing the gene expression values using RNA sequencing technology. Can you actually infer the gene regulatory network from the observed gene expression values? Or in the human brain, you may be using some neuroimaging modality and measure the actual neurophysiological signals or the blood flow, depending on the modality, signals at different locations across the brain. Can you infer the underlying connectivity pattern? So challenges with this problem is uniqueness of your solution. So that's very hard to verify. Evaluation of your results, because usually there is no ground truth in this case, because you can't really open up and look into the brain. So you can compare with structural connectivity, but justification or evaluation is hard. And scalability of these methods. So once the number of nodes increase, this method becomes computationally complex. So I'm going to give examples in all these three areas in the remaining part of the talk. So the first problem is community detection, which is the simplest one, where you're given the community structure and you want to identify, partition the network's nodes such that the intra-community connections are dense and the inter-community connections are sparse. Why is this important to do? So if the network is small, you really don't care about the community structure, but in a lot of cases, in real world data sets, the data is quite large, for example, in social networks. So to be able to make sense out of this large network data, you may want to find users that behave in a similar manner or that have similar interests. So, for example, recommendation systems do that a lot, like Netflix use a recommendation system, Amazon does use a recommendation system. So finding people that behave like you, for identifying these communities, help these companies give you recommendations. So whenever you go to Amazon or Netflix, it will give you recommendations of these are movies that you may like because you're friends with these people or you are there in their social network. So that's a use for community detection. Another application is biological networks. So protein or gene interactions in a cell that can help you identify diseases. However, as I mentioned before, most of the existing work on community detection focus on single layer networks, just deal with single networks. However, in a lot of applications, the networks that we see are kind of a summary, is an aggregation of the different types of interactions. So in a lot of real world cases, we have multiple types of interactions. So you may be thinking of transportation networks where you have different cities, and those cities may be connected by bus, they may be connected by train, they may be connected by flights or air traffic. So these are three different modes of interaction, and that can actually tell you different information about the interactions between the different cities. So instead of putting them all together in a single layer network, why don't we look at them simultaneously? Or in social networks, you may have the same group of people interacting over Google or Instagram, Twitter, MySpace, or Facebook, and those interactions may be different, so why don't we look at them simultaneously? Another example could be in the brain. You may be interested in functional connectivity networks or structural connectivity. Moreover, in functional connectivity, you may be interested in connectivity across different frequency bands, resulting in a multiplex or a multi-layer network. So these are the types of networks that I call high-dimensional, or in literature, they're usually referred to as multi-layer networks. So how do you obtain some sort of structure from these high-dimensional networks? So one problem is community detection, and existing methods with these high-dimensional networks mostly focused on identifying the consensus community structure. What that means is trying to fit some community structure that best explains all the layers that you have. However, most real networks are heterogeneous, so your community on LinkedIn may be very different than your community on Facebook, even if you're connected to the same people, because one is a work type of relationship, one is a friendship type of relationship. So how can I take this into account? How can I take heterogeneity into account? So what we did is we proposed a framework where we identify both what is common across layers and what is private to each layer. So this is like a cartoonish representation of what we did, is given a 3-layer network. In this case, there are 2 common orange communities between layers 1 and 2, and then there is a common community between layer 1 and 3, but everything else is unique to that particular layer. So how can I actually identify those? We proposed a method that we call multiplex orthogonal non-negative matrix factorization. I'll just briefly mention it, where we write each layer's adjacency matrix. So we have the graphs for each layer. We represent each layer's graph through an adjacency matrix that shows the connections. Then we write each layer's adjacency matrix as the sum of 2 low-rank matrix factorizations, where the first term in each layer is capturing what is common. So H is the matrix that captures what is common across layers. And then I have something unique to each layer. And this is an illustration of this. So in this case, the reds are the common community, so those will go into the H part. And the green is unique to layer 1, the purple is unique to layer 2, and the yellow is unique to layer L. So I have both of them, and I write this as an optimization problem, and we solve this. So I'll show one application of this. This is like a data set from a law firm in the United States. It's called the Lazeca Law Firm, where you have, it's a relatively small data set where you have 71 lawyers in a particular law firm. And you have 3 types of relationships between them, representing the interactions between the same 71 people. So one is co-work relationship. So do they actually work on cases together? One is a friendship network, and one is an advice network. So advice meaning like more senior people advising the younger people in the law firm. And we took this 3-layer network and we applied our method. And what we obtained is, we obtained one common community, the red one, across all 3 layers. So there's like a community of people or a subgroup of people that are connected to each other, whether it's through working together or being friends or through advice. And then we have a private community. So like in the first layer, we have this green and blue community that describes the co-work relationship. In the friendship layer, we have this yellow community, a larger community. And in the advice layer, we have this orange and purple community. One thing we did is like, are these communities meaningful? So what we looked at is that we also had some information about each one of these people. For example, we knew the status of their status in the law firm, so whether they're junior or a partner in the law firm. The office location, so this was a law firm with 3 locations, I think, in the New England area. How many years they have been within the firm, what is their age, what type of law they practice, and what law school did they go to. So based on each attribute, we computed how well does our community structure agree with a particular attribute. What that means is like, if I had clustered these people just based on their gender, would that be a good description of the communities that I find? So, and we quantify this using a normalized mutual information metric. And we're comparing with other methods, which I'm not going to get into here. But the highest agreement or the highest mutual information, it was based on the office location. So the communities that I find is in agreement with the office location, which makes a lot of sense. The next highest agreement was within gender. So there was definitely a gender-based separation. And then the next sorry, I missed the one, practice, the type of law that they practice. So they are actually tend to be more in the same community based on their practice and office location. The other attributes tend to play a less role in the community structure. The next topic I want to talk about is when you have both the connectivity, both the graph structure, but in addition to that, you have some signals or attributes in each node. So it could be a social network, and then each node you have the person's hobbies, the school they went to, the job that they're doing, those types of attributes. Why is this important? Because in most real-world networks, you would have both the connectivity and node attributes available. A lot of the classical work in community detection, they usually either use the connectivity information without using the node attributes, or they would just use the node attributes, do clustering without using the graphical structure. So what we're saying in the last 10 years, there has been more of a move towards using both of them. How can we consider both the node attributes and network connectivity. This is a challenging problem because there are very different types of data. One is a graphical structural data. The other could be just like a vector of attributes or numbers or binary. So what we proposed to do was use the ideas based on graph signal processing, which I will explain very briefly. What we're saying, and our method is called Graphica, which stands for graph filtering for community detection and attributed graphs. So what we're saying is that just like in regular signal processing, where you have filters, you can also define filters on graphs and for graph signals. So we're treating the attributes as signals, and we're proposing to learn polynomial graph filters. But one thing that we're doing is I want to optimize graph filters such that the filtered signal attributes are more separable than the original ones. So I want to find the optimal one that will discriminate between the different classes as much as possible. So this is how we define the graph filter, which I will not get into, but the filtered graph signal is defined through a simple multiplication. So it's kind of like, if you're familiar with regular filtering in the time domain is convolution. In the frequency domain is multiplication. So it's kind of the same idea. This is the filter in the frequency domain, and you multiply with the attributes. And we propose this framework where the input is you have the graph structure, you have the attributes. You first cluster based on the attributes. You get an initial cluster matrix, Z prime. Then you design the filter, and you get filtered attributes, F tilde. You cluster using this filtered attributes, you get a new Z bar. And you continue iterating between these two processes until it converges. In the end, you get both a Z bar, which tells you the cluster identity, which cluster community each node belongs to. And you also learn a graph filter that tells you how to filter the signals. So we formulated this as a cost function, and I will not get into the optimization of this. So I'll show an application of this on a social network. Where we applied is a citation network. So each node is a paper. The edges are if that paper cited another paper, and the attributes could be keywords about that paper. So this is a well-known publicly available data set with 2,708 nodes. The number of attributes at each node is over 1,000, and we know there are 7 classes. So 7 groups of papers depending on the area. So what I'm showing here is like a scatter plot of the different classes before these are the attributes before I actually did any filtering. So you can see that the colors are kind of intertwined with each other. It's not that easy to separate the different classes. This is after my optimal filter. So I learned my optimal filter, which is given here, and I won't get into the details of what this filter means, but you can see that it's mostly a low-pass filter. After I filter my attributes, you can see that like purple is separated from green, and blue is all over here, and pink is separated from the others. So you actually get a much better separation between the classes after the filtering. And we actually tried it on multiple data sets with attributes and show how this filtering improves the clustering. And we have another application of this that I'm going to talk briefly about, which is on EEG data. So I won't get into the details of this. This is a brain electroencephalogram data collected from 20 subjects when they perform task called a flanker task, where they're seeing a very simple string of 5 letters. Either the middle letter is the same as the others or it's not, and they have to make a really quick decision by pressing a button. And sometimes because it's speeded, they make an mistake, an error, and in the brain potential you see this error related negative potential. So we focused on the data from these subjects. We looked at their brain connectivity graphs. So the graphs are the connectivity graphs. The graph signals are the actual brain potentials recorded by EEG from these 20 subjects to identify their the clustering of the different regions. So I'll talk very briefly about this. On the left is this community structure that we learned across the 20 subjects. So there is like one blue community, which is frontal central area, which is the most important area for this task. One community in the frontal area, one community is in the parietal occipital, so that corresponds to the visual task, and one is in the motor cortex area corresponding to pressing the buttons. So this is like the consensus common community across all these subjects. The other thing we did is we look at how consistent each of these nodes community assignment across all the subjects. And we found that the most consistent one are the frontal and central one, which is something that we expected. So now I'm moving to the third topic, which is the most challenging case, where you don't have the graph structure, and this is usually the case for biological systems, where you observe some phenomena and you want to learn the graphical structure. So this is where we use graph signal processing ideas of filtering signal recovery. As I said, this is a case where there is no unique solution. You have to make some assumptions relating the graph topology and the signals that you're observing. So the most common assumption that people make is smoothness-based graph learning. What we are saying that the signal representation has some interpretation in the graph frequency domain, and smoothness means that if two nodes are connected to each other, then their signal values should be similar to each other, so that there is a smooth transition between connected nodes on a graph. So using this smoothness idea, smoothness in the graph frequency domain corresponds to a low frequency representation. So here I am showing three cases. If you look at them, the three of them, the graph signals are exactly the same. So you have 9 different nodes in this graph, and you're observing the same signal. And there are infinitely many ways that these signals may be connected to each other. And that's what this graph is showing. But if I want to find the representation such that my signal is smoothest with respect to the underlying graph, I would choose G1. Why? Because in G1, you see that all the nodes that have positive amplitudes, so V1 has positive amplitude and is connected to only a positive amplitude node. Similarly, V3 is connected to V4, and the negative amplitude signals are connected to each other. You do not have any connection between positive and negative amplitude nodes. Whereas in G2, you have a positive amplitude node like V3 connected to V7. So that makes it non-smooth. Similarly, in G3, you have V4 connected to V7, V3 connected to V6. So you have a lot of high frequency transitions because you have things that are not similar or opposite of each other connected to each other. So if my goal is smoothness, I would choose G1 as the best graph. So mathematically, the smoothness has been represented like this. So what it means is if the value of xi and xj are similar to each other, which means this difference will be very small, then I would actually put a weight there, wij being the weight of the edge between the two nodes. On the other hand, if they're very dissimilar to each other, so this difference will be large, I'm going to try to minimize that large difference by putting an edge of 0. So this can be written in terms of the graph Laplacian, and the graph is learned by minimizing this smoothness or total variation. of the signal with respect to the graph, and you learn the graph Laplacian using this optimization problem. So there are some challenges and that we addressed in our work. Most of this work is limited to unsigned graphs, but in social sciences and biology, we may be interested in different types of relationships. For example, if someone is a friend versus enemy, or in biology, is there an activating relationship or inhibiting relationship? So for that, we would need to use sign graphs. Another thing, kind of similar to what I talked about in community detection, most of this work is again limited to single graphs, but you may have data coming from multiple closely related graphs. So how do you learn multi-view graphs? And I will show some examples in both single-cell gene regulatory networks and neuroimaging. So sign graph learning means you have both positive edges and negative edges. So what we propose to do in our work, without getting into too much of detail, we kind of separated this into two graphs, saying let's learn simultaneously a positive graph and a negative graph. And over the positive edges, positive meaning they are similar or they are friends, the signals should be smooth with respect to the graph. Over the negative graph, negative meaning they're not friends or they're inhibiting each other, so the signals should be very dissimilar, so non-smooth. So this is like the main idea of learning two graphs. One is smooth, one is non-smooth, and we formulated as an optimization problem like this. And we apply this to gene regulatory network inference to representing the molecular regulatory interactions among genes. And we want to find both activating or inhibiting relationships. And as I said, these are sign graphs, and there are lots of challenges. The data is noisy, it's heterogeneous, and moreover, the data is very sparse. So dealing with these challenges, we applied it to some smaller cell networks. One is from the human, one is from the mouse. So this is embryonic stem cell. So this is the development of the embryo, so embryonic stem cell, and mouse embryonic stem cell. And what we're showing here is that we are learning both the inhibiting edges, red ones, and the blue ones. Of course, as I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk, in these cases, the challenge is that you do not have a ground truth to compare. So we're basically using some biological knowledge to say, okay, this makes sense because there are activating relationships between endotherm markers like these genes, and there are inhibitory relationships between for genes that are pluripotency markers. So it's just a qualitative evaluation. Another challenge I mentioned before is that what if you have data from multiple closely graphs? So one example of this is the brain. So you may have EEG data from multiple subjects, like the example I gave before, that are doing exactly the same task. And let's say these are all healthy people doing exactly the same task. So you would expect that their brain connectivity, so the different subjects' connectivity, will have something in common. So instead of learning each subject's connectivity, inferring the graph individually, let's do it jointly so that I can use information across the subjects. And what we're doing is we're learning both subject-specific graphs and a group-level consensus graph. And that should help in our individual graph learning as well. So we did apply this to EEG data, and this is our formulation. Now I'm learning LI's individual graphs from each subject's data. And I'm also learning a group level graph where I'm making each individual graph and group level graph have some sort of similarity. So this is my consensus cost function, something like mean square error. And I also put in our regularization on the consensus graph. So we did apply this to EEG data, and I'll show some brief results. So we look at the consensus graph structure, community structure. It's exactly the same EEG data. We see that, again, FCZ is very important by itself, and there are like clusters in the frontal, occipital regions and central parietal regions. So there's a nice separation of the different areas. Another thing we looked at is what is the difference of learning each subject's graph separately, which is the orange line here, and the one that we learn jointly. And what I'm showing here is this total variation. So how smooth are my signals with respect to the learned graphs if I change the edge density in the graphs? So what I'm showing is that when I learn it jointly, the signals are much more smooth with respect to the graphs compared to where I'm actually learning each graph individually. So this is basically, I'm reducing the variation because I'm learning across multiple subjects. A couple of examples or observations here that our method identifies both the group level, consensus, and individual graphs, and the learned graphs are smooth. The other things is that we did identify regions that correspond to visual, motor region, frontal central regions in the brain, so that is consistent with prior work. So now I'm just going to summarize and conclude and give some future work going on in my group and in others. So I hope I made it clear that relational data are abundant in a variety of applications. So even if the data does not come in a network structure, it can be modeled using graphs. So social systems, biological systems, infrastructure systems, which I don't work on, but it has a lot of applications like power systems or transportation systems. Graphs provide an efficient way to model and process such data. And we presented different methods, both from learning from graphs when the graph structure is known, and learning of graphs when you have structured data, but you don't know the graph structure. So I gave examples for both cases. So future things that we're working on, one is community detection in sign graphs. So sign graphs are actually more common than we think. And this includes also extension of community detection to different graph types. Graph learning with structure. So right now we learn graphs such that the signals are smooth with respect to the graph structure, but you could actually learn graph with a particular structure. So you can say, what if we learn graphs that have a modular structure or a hub nodes? Then the other thing we worked on briefly, but which we want to extend, is why don't we put these two tasks together? Why don't I do simultaneously learn the graph data and community detection? So given heterogeneous data, can I simultaneously cluster and learn the graphs? And another problem we're currently working on is anomaly detection in graphs type of data. So this is another type of structure discovery in graph type of data. So can I identify outliers? And these could be different types of outliers. It could be anomalous nodes. So it could be anomalous edges, or it could be anomalous groups of people, communities. And how can we do that with graphical structure? So I'll just finally want to acknowledge the support from National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. And most of this work was done by my current and previous PhD students. So Dr. Abdullah Karaslanlı, who is now a postdoc at University of Michigan, Dr. Tamanna Munia, who is now in industry, my current PhD student, maybe Ortiz Buza, and our collaborator, Professor Jason Mosier in the Department of Psychology at Michigan State University. Well, with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and I'll be happy to take on any questions.
Thanks, Professor Celine. That was very informative and distinctive presentation, actually. And nice work, actually.
Thank you.
Any question to Professor Celine? Can you please raise your hand if you want to ask any question or send your question by chat? Any questions? Raise your hand if you have any questions. Or send your questions by chat, please. Or if you wanna have like any suggestions or comments,
I have one question.
please go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Professor.
Hello.
Thank you for the presentation. It was really nice. But I have seen recently some research papers using the graph theory for fault detection in power system, but I'm not sure how that would be applicable for electric machines. Like in power system, they are using the nodes as the buses and the edges for the power flow between these buses, but I'm not sure about that for electric machines.
Yeah, no, I have seen it for power systems as well, and it's becoming very like over the grid because there's a natural graph structure there. But for electrical machines, I do not see that because you do not have a natural like a graph structure, underlying graph structure. Of course, you can create your own graph structure, but it may be a bit artificial in that case. So I'm not sure if it's as applicable for the types of problems that you're working on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see. Okay, thank you, Dr. Viente.
Any questions to Professor Celine? You can send your questions by chat if your mic is not working. Any question? More questions, please.
Well, I would like to ask a question, actually.
Go ahead, Doctor.
Thank you. About the model that you propose about the sign graphs in the last model that you talked about. If we could go back to the...
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, the next one.
Oh, was it this one, sign graph? This one? No?
I think it's related to this problem, but I just wanted to see there was a flow chart about the multiple subjects, multiple EEG data.
Yeah, that one is not signed.
Okay.
This one.
This is not signed graphs.
This is not signed, no.
Okay, so I just wanted to be clear, like what exactly, if you could explain a bit more about the model that you are proposing here.
Yeah, so what we're saying is that I am going to learn the connectivity networks for each subject, but instead of doing it each one individually, since they're all doing the same task, so there should be something similar, let's also learn a common graph. So this is like the formulation. So we're learning Li, the Laplacian for each individual by minimizing the total variation. We have this regularization that controls the sparsity of each graph. Then we're also learning a consensus graph such that the consensus graph is as close as possible to each one of the individual graphs. So this consensus term could be like a L2 mean square error or an L1 error. You know, you can come up inner product, correlation. You could come up with anything you want. And then we have like a regularization on this consensus graph. So we're learning if there are n subjects in this case, or n people, you're learning n plus one different graphs.
Okay. Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I have a question for you, Professor Celine.
Sure.
What is the big challenges that you face when you work on EEG data? I mean, I feel like the data set for EEG signal is not like available every time, and you need just to specify some areas from the brain, right, to determine the data set, and based on that to do some detection for disease or like for the the status of the patient in some applications. So how do you do you face any challenges in finding the best data set for that?
Right. So I didn't. One thing is that I have collaborators who collect their own EEG data. So I get the EEG data usually from them. So you usually get either as like a 64 channels or 128 channels. And EEG has a very well established pre-processing pipeline. So unlike fMRI, it's actually much easier, I think, to work with EEG because it's smaller and the pre-processing is not as arbitrary. Like with fMRI, you have to have the different atlases, and they're like, I don't know how many, 20, 30, as many different ways as atlases as different research groups do it differently. Whereas with EEG, it's much more standardized. So, and nowadays there are actually more open source EEG data sets that are available that I did not even realize about until recently. So there are like Open Neuro that shares some EEG data sets. Kaggle, which is like the data challenge site that Google sponsors. So they do have some EEG data sets from healthy and schizophrenic subjects. So it used to be that finding open source EEG data was almost impossible, but I feel like now that's changing slowly. So there are different universities that are making data available and also making the pipelines for cleaning the data available as well.
Actually, because I know some colleagues here at Yarmouk University, and they always tell that they face a problem in finding the best data set of EEG signal. So when they want to apply that in real world, they find that the data set is not enough to give the correct decision about the status of the patient, for example, or the person that they are measuring their signals. So now you are saying
Right.
there's enough data on EEG signals.
Right. It used to be. So most of the open source data sets used to be all on brain-computer interface, BCI competitions. And I never looked at that data because that's not my interest. And those data used to be much more limited because for BCI, the goal is not to use the full EEG, but just use a couple of electrodes, couple of regions. But for diseases, you actually need the full EEG. So now there is more open source for epilepsy. I know there is a group at University of Southern California that is making it available at USC, EEG data for epilepsy. So that's one that I know about, and I think there's some others that as well from other sources.
Actually, I always have this question about EEG. Like, when do we expect to have individual and common structure between subjects? Because we know that everyone's brain is different from the brain of others. So even if you find a data set, you will not have common features between several or different peoples, right?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I think that's an ongoing thing. So I think given a particular task, there's definitely something common, but everyone's connectivity patterns is really unique to themselves. So the question I am posing, and I'd like to answer using these methods, is what is common and what is varying, and how do things that are common and variant change with respect to the disease? So these were all healthy people, but with disease, would they have, for example, this is something that's known that with schizophrenia, for example, what is common within schizophrenics is very random. So there may not be much common just because everyone in that group is schizophrenic doesn't mean that they exhibit it in exactly the same way. So there's a lot of randomness and variability.
Because we always expect inferred structures between different persons, right?
Right.
Yeah. Different structures, even if if we assume there is common structure, but we should consider no, the structure is not common, right?
Right. I mean, a lot of analysis has been made up till very recently at the group level. So let's look at the network for all describing schizophrenics. And now people are saying, well, that's not really the way to do it.
Nice. Thank you.
No, you're welcome.
My colleagues actually is asking me to ask you, like, if you are receiving students in your lab, do you have any opening to hire students like for like grad studies, for example, in future?
Yeah, I mean, I usually do. This year I actually just got 2 new students, so I'm not sure about next year.
They're from
Things might
Jordan,
change.
right?
Yeah,
I think they're from Jordan.
right. Yeah.
You know that. Thank you. Any question to Professor Serene?
Professor, I just have one follow-up question about fault detection for electric machines.
Yes,
So in
sure.
power system, we said the nodes are used to model the buses in power system. Okay,
Mhm.
but in electric machines, so are we modeling the system itself, the electric machine itself, or the features from the signals that we have for different faults? So I just want to make sure that I understand it correctly here.
I mean, in electrical machines, you have either the voltage or current, right?
Yep.
So you do not necessarily have too many different types of signals.
At least the vibration signal, like the EEG that you are presenting here,
Mhm.
and you are working in vibration signal. So if we are using that signal for fault detection, can we do the graph theory on that signal, similar to what you are doing here?
Well, with EEG though, I do have an underlying physical model, right? Because
Okay.
I'm connecting across different sensors on the brain and they have different locations. So I do have that fixed, like a proximity information, for example. So with electrical machines, I'm not sure I can see how you can, I mean, I'm not saying you can't do it, but it's not as natural. I can't see like, another thing I would say is that like with EEG or fMRI, you have usually at least in the order of 60s or hundreds of different signals. And you have their relationships and you have the physical location. So if you have only 2 or 3 signals, graph models would not really make sense. So you actually have to have a reasonable size graph structure.
Okay, I see.
Yeah, that's another issue. Yeah.
I see.
Any more questions for Dr. Serene? Okay, Professor Serene, thanks for your informative and distinctive speech. That was very great, like contribution to our research series, actually. Thanks for joining us for today. And like, I'm very happy to meet you on Zoom, and I would like to meet you in person, inshallah. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you all for attending and all the questions.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Have a good evening.
You too, thank you. Bye-bye.
يعطيكم العافية، شكرا.